So let's keep adding different regions. Now we are going to look at Egypt and Africa very briefly. I'm just following the chapters in the book People of the Earth. When you think of Egypt, of course, Nile comes to mind, and we talked about the Aswan Dam already, I think. Or we will talk about it later on in terms of modern human impacts. And Africa always brings to mind Sahel and Sahara, the pastoralists and their rich history as well. So many civilizations and the famous pyramids and so on come from Egypt, so obviously that's related to how culture and agriculture evolved over the Nile during the Holocene. We talked about hunter-gatherers in chapter 5, and looking at Southwest Asia we talked about Natufian and Jericho. We will talk more about recent cultures in chapter 15. Again, going from hunter-gatherers of the Egypt and Nile Valley, we'll jump straight to Nabta Playa, where agriculture is now important, and then Fayum more later, and Merimde and unification of Egypt we'll discuss in chapter 16. The Sahara and Sub-Saharan Africa, we have discussed hunter-gatherers in chapter 7 a little. Cattle domestication happened in Sahara around the year 7500 to 7000 in the middle of the Holocene climatic optimum. I think we were beginning to get out of the green Africa by then, probably disappeared a little bit later on, and Saharan cattle herders, which are still around, pastoralists and so on, are still there, and a way of life. And there was some debate in the modern times about whether the long-lasting drought over the Sahara for multiple decades into the 1960s, 1940s or so into the 1980s, I think. There was some idea that the overgrazing of land was adding to the desertification and drought, but it turned out that actually the ocean warming was responsible for that drought to persist for so long, and that ocean warming was actually related to emissions and aerosol emissions, greenhouse gas emissions and aerosol emissions, which mostly came from the Western world, or rich countries like US, North America and Europe. So we have to be careful about those things. Chapter 16 will look again at cattle herders in East Africa, another semi-arid region we talked about in the context of East African herdification, bipedalism and evolution of our ancestors as well. In terms of innovations, beginnings of agriculture in Egypt happened around 5,000 years ago. Cattle herding in Sahara was another innovation that happened around 4,000 years ago, and Sahara becomes drier, so end of the green Sahara, and then Sahara has been a desert over the last so many thousand years, and Sahel is the boundary between the dry desert and the wet Central African forests and so on. Okay, so what happened over here? Food production was probably introduced into the Nile Valley at a time of drought by 6000 BC, so green Africa was over by then. Hunter-gatherers of the Nile and of the then habitable Sahara were pre-adapted to the new economies, which they may have taken up as a means of staving off food shortages in drought years. So how you deal with drought may depend on buying food with what you can sell, or adapting somehow with the land you have, because moving is still was not easy for many of these, other than maybe the nomadic cattle herders and pastoralists. By 4000 BC, agriculture was well established along the Nile, and cattle were being domesticated and herded in the depths of Sahara. Nile Valley communities soon became dependent on agriculture and relied on natural flooding to water their gardens until about 3000 BC. So during the Green Africa, you saw that the civilization spread out into West Africa, especially following the water from the Nile, but as aridification or droughts began and the greening was over, they began to come back to the Nile, and you can see some of that here. And how the dependence on agriculture happens, and the rainfall seasons and Nile originate. One of the Niles, White Nile, originates in Lake Victoria, for example. So there is a seasonal flooding which changes in the amount of flooding from year to year because of things like El Nino and so on. That has typically been the driver of agriculture and natural flooding for gardening and so on. Nile Delta, of course, used to be one of the most fertile grounds and related to the civilizations that evolved over there. We'll see that later, and we'll also see how Aswan Dam has changed this dynamic, including the fisheries and so on. Okay. So as the Sahara dried up after 5000 BC, pastoralists with cereal crops moved south of the desert, so into wetter regions, introducing cattle herding as far south as East African highlands. So East African highlands basically separate kind of the monsoon regime in the central west and the drier regions to the northwest, and to the east of it you have, of course, very varied vegetations we talked about, with grasslands, savannas and so on being dominant. East African highlands also play a critical role in steering, or at least being some kind of a western boundary for the monsoon circulation into India. Okay, winds cross from the equator across from south across the equator and then hit the African highlands and turn towards the east over to India, bringing all that monsoon and moisture. Cereal cultivation based on shifting agriculture did not take hold in much of sub-Saharan Africa until the introduction of ironworking south of the desert in the first millennium BC, so very recently. So we will talk about those when we come back. Okay, so we'll add a couple of more cultures along the way just to complete the story from the other book and add a few more points. Okay.